The Lord be with you.
You.
A reading from the Gospel of Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
I picked out for today as Easter Sunday, obviously. I picked out one of my favorite resurrection stories. It's from Luke's Gospel. And because we've heard this so many times, we don't hear it. So I just want you to imagine that you're living 2,000 years ago and you're reading this story or hearing this story at a campfire for the first time ever. The young Jesus movement has gone through the most extraordinary roller coaster of its existence, beginning on Palm Sunday with the extraordinary celebration of Jesus as the Messiah into Jerusalem. And then over the course of the week, it's just tumultuous. He gets killed, crucified, killed in one of the most vicious ways possible to kill another human being. And then he's gone. And then there's this crazy story that the women report that they went to the tomb on Sunday morning and it was empty. He was gone. So there's two of them who've just left Jerusalem and they're walking to a little village which is 7 miles away called Emmaus, and Jesus joins them, but they don't recognize him. So here's the story. Now, that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had just happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked with them, but they did not recognize him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Clopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that happened there in the last few days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, this is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find the body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said to them, he was alive. Then some of our companions rushed to the tomb and found it just as the women said, but they didn't see Jesus." Then he said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe everything that the prophets had spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and so enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning the Messiah. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus pretended as if he was going to go further. But they urged him strongly, stay with us, stay with us. It's nearly evening, the day is almost over." So he agreed and went in to stay with them. When they sat down at table, he took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Then they got up immediately and returned to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together, and they were saying, "It's true, the Lord has risen and appeared to Simon." Then the two from Emmaus told them what had happened to them on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. Words inspired by God. In the fall of 1987, I came to Palo Alto to begin my studies in transpersonal psychology. And those of you, those long-timers who've lived here in Palo Alto, you know that there was a Woolworths on University Avenue. Any of you guys remember that? Yeah, big Woolworths store with a big glass front on it. So I go down there early on one day, and I want to buy some 2-inch binders for my notes in school. And I'm standing right in front of the window, but because of the angle of the sun, it's just a glare. The sun is shining right on the window. So there's a glare hitting me, and the only thing I can see is my own reflection. I'm looking in to see if I can find 2-inch binders before I go into the shop and whether I can afford them or not. So I'm standing there and I'm blinded by the glare of the sun, and when I look, all I can see is my own reflection. And then suddenly I figured out if you adopt a Buddhist gaze, what they call a soft gaze, if you change your focal length, it creates a kind of an altered state of consciousness. So I do that, and all of a sudden, I can penetrate the glare. I'm no longer looking simply at my own image in the glass. I'm seeing right inside, and bingo, there are the 2-inch binders that I wanted. And it became for me a kind of a metaphor. The realization that there are some things you can only see if you change your focal length. There are some things you can only see if you change your state of consciousness. The normal state of consciousness isn't able to deliver a whole bunch of stuff to you. You have to shift into an altered state of consciousness. You have to kind of go into vision mode, or dream mode, or meditation mode in order to be able to see some things. And so it reminded me that when I lived in Kenya, when I talked about the kingdom of heaven, I would say to people in Swahili, Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. It's a pun, obviously. You can hear the alliteration, in the Swahili. Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. Translated, you can't get the pun in translation, but in translation it means the kingdom of heaven is not a place, it's a state of consciousness. Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. So you get at that there are some truths that can only be grokked when you change the way you're looking at them. If you have to abandon the sensorium and access them from the heart or from the soul. And that's particularly important when you're looking at the scriptures. A lot of the time we approach the scriptures either with just an intellect or a kind of a literalist, fundamentalist, fear-based exegesis, and we quake in front of them. In order to really mine and harvest the scriptures, you need to change the way in which you approach it. You need to change the mindset. You need to adopt an altered state of consciousness in order to really understand what the scriptures are telling you. And on Easter Sunday 2019, that's precisely what I want to do with a few of the scriptures this morning. I'm going to make 3 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to just tell 6 resurrection stories and try to exegete them or understand them from a mystical viewpoint rather than from a literal viewpoint. Secondly, I'm going to say something like, appearances can be deceptive. And then thirdly, I want to really dig into the 2 main lessons of Easter, which really are resurrection and Eucharist. So they're the 3 things I'll do this morning. So first, a few resurrection stories. There's this great story in John's Gospel in chapter 20, where Mary of Magdala with a few other women go out to the tomb early in the morning because they want to anoint the body. Because Jesus was buried on Friday evening as Shabbat was beginning, or the Passover was starting, they weren't allowed to anoint the body. That was servile work. So he's kind of laid crudely in the tomb with a blanket wrapped around him. And he's left there, and the stone is rolled in front of the cave. Now, early on Sunday morning, Shabbat is officially over, and they're rushing out in order to anoint the body correctly, according to Jewish custom. And then in the way, you think, who's going to roll the stone back for us? A huge, big rock. But they get there, and the stone has been moved, and the body is gone. And they freak out. And they run back, and they tell the disciples, Peter and John, he's gone. Somebody took the body. And John and Peter race out with Mary trying to catch up with them, and they go down there, and the tomb is empty, and the linens are folded up very neatly. So either the angels or Jesus has had some form of OCD. Who else wraps up a burial shroud and places it neatly? But it's placed neatly there, and the thing that wrapped his head is placed neatly there. So they rush back. They don't know how to understand this. But Mary stays there, and she's crying. And she looks into the tomb again, and there's an angel there. And the angel says to him, woman, why are you crying? And she said, because they've taken my Lord, and I don't know where they put the body. And then she looks around, and there's somebody approaching her, and it's Jesus. And she thinks it's the gardener. Now, this is an honest mistake, because carpenters and gardeners always look the same. She thinks it's the gardener. She says, sir, if you've removed the body, tell me where you put it, and I'll come and take it. Now, can you imagine Mary schlepping the dead Christ, back into Jerusalem on her own? But that was the connection she had with him. And then Christ pronounces this one word, Mary, or Mariamu. Except I don't believe that that's actually the word that he used. I'm totally convinced that as souls are launched into incarnation, the last thing that grandmother God whispers in our ear is our secret, sacred name. Every soul has a secret, sacred name, and that's the last thing. Don't forget who you really are. And that's the name that Jesus used for Mary. I have no idea what it might have been. Maybe it was Mariamo, but Mary recognized it, and Christ had recognized it. And of course, immediately, Mary knew that it was Jesus there. So she flings herself at him and holds on to him. And he says a very strange thing. He says, Mary, don't cling to me. And we think somehow that this is kind of the celibate Jesus saying, back off, lady, I've took a vow of celibacy. Has nothing got to do with that, of course. In some senses, the deeper meaning, the mystical meaning is, Mary, the relationship we've had, as physical beings. I'm a human, you're a human, we've known each other for many times. That relationship is gone. I'm no longer a physical being. Don't cling to the version of me that you knew. There's a new Jesus at a different level, vibrating at a very, very different level. And that's the invitation to all of us. At some stage in our spiritual journey, we have to abandon the Jesus of our childhood and grow up to a far deeper understanding of who Jesus really is. We can't just cling to the old notion of Jesus. We have to understand a totally different relationship with this Christ figure. And I'll talk about that towards the end. And so he says to her, go back and tell my brothers and sisters that you have seen me. And she goes back. She rushes back in order to explain to him, I have seen him. So there's the first story from John's Gospel. The story I just read from Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 24. It's Sunday morning again. And these two disconsolate disciples are walking 7 miles to a little village called Emmaus. And they're talking desolately but animatedly with each other about this extraordinary week that has just happened. And then this character joins them, and it's Jesus. But for some reason, again, they do not recognize him. And he comes up and he says, what are you guys talking about? And are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been happening here for the last week? He says, no, what's been happening? You don't know about Jesus of Nazareth that we thought was the Messiah? We were all following him. We thought this is it. He's going to redeem Israel. But he got crucified. I know there's this mishigas going on today. Some crazy women from our group came and told us that they went to the tomb and he's gone, that he's risen. Some angel told them he's risen. Christ says, wow, interesting story. And then he says, well, you know what about when you really sift through the Hebrew scriptures, Isaiah said this, and Jeremiah said that, and Ezekiel said the other, and Amos said this. Weren't they all talking about what needed to happen when the Messiah did come? And their hearts are glowing. Wow, we never thought about it like that. So they come to the village, and they're going to spend the night there, and Jesus pretends he's going to go on further. And they say, no, please stay with us. Look, it's night time already. Come in and have a meal with us. So he joins them for a meal. And they're sitting down at the table, and the food arrives, probably bread and wine probably, and he takes the bread, and he breaks it, and he blesses it, and he starts distributing it. All of a sudden, their eyes are wide open. Now, this is something you're going to see again and again and again throughout the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. The way in which they typically recognize Jesus, those who fail to recognize him, they always recognize him in the breaking of the bread. So there's this extraordinary connection between Eucharist and resurrection. If you understand resurrection, you understand Eucharist. And if you understand Eucharist, you understand resurrection. If you don't get resurrection, Eucharist is meaningless. And if you don't get Eucharist, resurrection never happened. So there's again and again and again, there's this extraordinary connection between the two. And I'll say more about that at the very end of the homily. And so they break bread together, and then they recognize him. And as soon as they recognize him, poof, he's gone. Now, the guy obviously had a sense of humor. He pretended, firstly, that he hadn't heard what had happened in Jerusalem, for the last few days. If anybody had a bird's eye view of it, he should have said, you should have seen what I looked like from the cross. But he didn't. So, he had a great sense of humor. And then they come to the village, and he pretends like he's going further. No, stay with us. So he's pulling their legs constantly. So if you think that Jesus was this kind of sour-faced Messiah, you've got another think coming to you. But they do exactly what Mary of Magdala did. They rush back the 7 miles to Jerusalem to tell the rest, he really is risen. And they meet the whole group there. That's the second story. The third story then, in the upper room where they had celebrated the Last Supper. And they're gathered there because they're afraid that the authorities are going to arrest them next, and they're going to wind up getting crucified. So they're hiding out. And all of a sudden, Jesus is right there in the middle of them. The doors were locked, and suddenly he's standing there. Now, this group recognized him, but they recognized him as a ghost. They were absolutely scared They were scared of two things. Firstly, this guy is a ghost. And secondly, he must be a very, very, very angry ghost. Because the last time we saw him, we were running and abandoning him. And Peter even denied 3 times that he even knew who the guy was. So they're still, oh my God, 2 strikes against us. It's a ghost, and it's a very, very angry ghost. And Christ says, Shalom Aleichem. He repeated it. Shalom Aleichem. Peace be with you. I'm not angry. I didn't come here to berate you. I'm not back here to kind of get revenge. I'm here in peace. And I'm not a ghost. Is there any food here? And they produced some fish. And there again, you have a Eucharistic encounter. He didn't just take a bit of fish and nosh in it, a little bit of sushi, from the local restaurant. They had a meal together. And it's interesting to me that when you look through the Gospels, particularly in John's Gospel, most of the Eucharists are not about bread and wine. They're about bread and fish. No, I'm glad actually that we changed that. Can you imagine, back here in the sacristy, we keep hosts and wine for 5 or 6 months at a time. If we had, fish and wine back there for 5 months, there'd be nobody receiving communion anymore. That was a good call. But in the Gospels, mostly the Eucharist consists of fish and bread. There may have been some wine on the side. So there's another Eucharistic encounter there. However, Thomas wasn't present on that occasion. So exactly 1 week later, they're up there again, and Jesus appears the second time in the upper room, and this time Thomas is with them. In the meantime, they'd been telling Thomas, he really is risen. He came, he stood among us, he ate some fish with us. And Thomas says, give me a break. Tell that to the Marines. So Thomas is there at this stage, and Jesus comes and is present. And Thomas is absolutely shangad at this stage, absolutely amazed. He gets down on his knees and says, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. He had an honours degree in Latin. And Jesus says a very famous thing. He says, Thomas, you believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who haven't seen and yet have believed. And this is a phrase that really sticks out for me because I went to Kenya in November of 1972 and I started learning Kiswahili. And in Easter of 1973, I gave my first homily in Swahili, and that was the biblical text. And I still remember the phrase in Swahili. It is, Heri wale wanaosadiki pasipo kuona. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So there was the 4th encounter. And again, it involves a Eucharistic encounter. The 5th one is very interesting. It's in John chapter 21. Now, they haven't seen Jesus for several weeks at this stage. And so they decide, well, let's go fishing. So 7 of them go out fishing, and they're fishing at night, and they catch nothing. And as dawn is breaking, they see this character on a little rise, and he's looking at them. They could barely make him out. And he said, did you catch anything? And you know, if you're a fisherman and you've been fishing and you caught nothing, that's the last thing you want anybody to ask you. He said, no. He said, okay, throw your nets onto the right side and see what happens. And they look, and they throw the nets, and they get this huge haul of fish. And then they realize, oh my God, it's the Lord. And Peter, being the brains of the outfit, Peter is naked at this stage. So he puts on his clothes, and then he dives into the water and he swims ashore. So anxious to get to see Jesus. And then the rest of them, they row the boat in and they drag the fish. And they see that Jesus has prepared a meal. There's another Eucharist just about to happen. He's got some fish and he's got some bread, but not enough fish for some reason. Now, why would it be that Jesus, who was able to feed 5,000 people in the desert, which is 2 loaves and a few fish, didn't have enough fish and bread to feed 8 people? And the reason, of course, is he was passing the baton. This was the end of his earthly mission. He was saying, up to now, I'm the guy who's been doing the fishing. Up to now, I'm the guy who's been doing the feeding. Now it's over. I'm passing the baton on to you guys. So you go get some of the fish that you have just caught, and we'll make that part of our Eucharistic meal. And Peter, being with the IQ of a genius again, goes down to pick up a few fish. And there's a big, big net full of fish. They're waiting anxiously. Breakfast is ready almost. They're really, really hungry. What does Peter do? He goes in and he counts the fish. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a big, 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 big net full of fish. Counting them is a really slippery business. You have to kind of relocate them from one section of the boat to the other if you really want to get an accurate count. So Peter goes and said, 1, 2, 3, and there's 153 of them. How long do you think it took him? 153. Yeah? But it's symbolic, because in Greek taxonomy, there were 153 different kinds of fish on planet Earth. So it represents every tribe, every nation, every culture. And what they're saying is, the kingdom of heaven is for everybody. Eucharist is for everybody. It's not just for baptized Catholics who went to confession on Saturday night and didn't commit sin, when they went out to the local pub. And it's not just for people who didn't get divorced and remarried. The church, the kingdom of heaven, is for everybody, and Eucharist is for everybody. So that is why it was so painful for me as a Catholic priest to be told, you can't give communion to non-Catholics. Or you can't give communion to people, who have divorced and remarried someplace else. It never made any sense to me. That the kingdom of God, the net that brought in 153 fish, meant it was for everybody. And then the final scene in that story is beautiful, where Peter, who was denied 3 times that he even knew who Jesus was, Jesus says, for a minute, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's really shameful. He says, I do. And Peter says, Jesus, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord. And Jesus finally, Peter, do you love me? And the 3rd time Peter says, yes. Now, is Christ some kind of a narcissist who's feeling kind of vulnerable and needs kind of somebody to tell him, I love you? He's not saying, do you, Peter, love me, Jesus, the carpenter from Nazareth? He's saying, Peter, do you recognize Christ consciousness? And if you recognize it in me, do you recognize it in Janice? Do you recognize it in Karen and Amelia? Do you recognize Christ? Do you recognize consciousness in everybody? Because if you do, you know what you need to do? You need to go and you need to feed my lambs and tend my sheep. You need to feed the Christ consciousness in everybody. You're a fisher of human beings at this stage. That's the invitation. It's not a kind of a vulnerable Jesus needing somebody to kind of shore up his self-confidence. It's asking, if you really love me, you see the Christ consciousness in me, and you see the Christ consciousness in everybody else, and then you have no other thing to do except go out and feed that in the world. So that was kind of the ending of that story. And then the 6th great resurrection story happens actually several years later. It's Paul on his horse on the road to Damascus, which is very interesting because Damascus, arguably, there's some controversy as to whether Damascus or Jericho is the oldest continuously inhabited human city on planet Earth. They both made the claim, one or the other. Archaeologically, you can establish that they go back so far that they can make the claim this is the oldest continuously inhabited city on planet Earth. And here's Paul on his way to Damascus. And he's going to wipe out this new Jesus movement. And on the road, he's knocked off his horse, and he hears a voice, and he's made blind. Now, nobody except him, hears the voice, but he hears it, but he's blinded. And then it's interesting that it's actually the 2nd time Paul has been blinded. Because the first time, he was blinded by his prejudice. He was blinded by a movement which is attempting to move a religion of legalism into a spirituality of love. He couldn't accept that he needed to make a shift from a religion based on legalism into a spirituality based on love. He couldn't make that shift. He was blind and he was prejudiced against such a move. That was the first blindness. Now the second blindness, literally he can't see, physiologically he can't see. He needed to undergo that symbolically to realize you have to I'll get rid of the physiological blindness, but you and only you can get rid of the spiritual blindness. And then Paul will dedicate his entire life to this new system, a system based not on a religion of law, but a spirituality of love. And in fact, Paul will say very famously in one of his letters, the discipleship of Jesus costs not less than everything. The discipleship of Jesus costs not less than everything. It doesn't mean that you've got to sell your motorbike and your home, and your fur coat and go out and stand in front of Safeway on a butter box and start preaching the end is nigh. He's not talking about that. He's saying that every faculty you have and every resource you have is part of your journey into Christ consciousness. And you must use everything you have. There are needs, of course, there are resources you need to live. Use them. but also realize that you're here in order to promote a shift into Buddha nature or Christ consciousness. That's what you need to do. So there's some 6 of the great resurrection stories. That's my first point. The second point then I'm going to say, appearances can be deceptive. When we talk about the appearances of Jesus, the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, the word appearance has many, many different possible meanings. So appearance can mean, for instance, demeanor. So if somebody says to you, how did Carmen appear to you this morning? You could say, she appeared to be really happy. So, appearance can mean just the demeanor. I always say to you, an appearance can be, how you're dressed. What was her appearance like at the grad ball? Oh, she came in an evening gown and high heels. That could be the appearance. Or how did he do? Oh, he came in a military uniform and a crew cut. So appearance can just be your physical, hairdo or outfit. It can mean that. Or appearance can mean an apparition, a ghost. We saw a ghost, oh my God, he appeared as a ghost. Or it can mean like a cameo appearance. I was visiting a friend of mine a few nights ago, and they were watching this program called The Big Bang Theory, yeah? Cooper Sheldon, that guy's. And there was a real scientist there, a guy called Kip Thorne, who actually is a Nobel laureate in physics. And he's playing a little role in this episode. Now, that would be a cameo appearance. So sometimes an appearance just means a cameo appearance. So is that what Jesus was doing? A little cameo appearance on planet Earth for a period of time? That's not how the word is used in the Greek. In the New Testament, the verb that's translated into English as appear has the sense of he chose to make himself visible to. Now it's as if Jesus is standing here in front of this lectern and all of us are looking in this direction, there will be some people who will see him and there will be other people who won't see him, because 2 things have to happen. Firstly, he has to choose to get into that particular frequency where he can be visible. And you have to make the shift in your state of consciousness where you can be in the same frequency as he is. Because I guarantee you, if he's up here, he's not vibrating between infrared and ultraviolet. He's not vibrating between 400 and 700 nanometers. He's not in that frequency. He's in a different frequency. And if you're trying to see in that frequency, you're not going to make contact with him. Unless you're going to make the shift in consciousness that allows you into a higher frequency, he can stand there forever and ever, and you won't see him. So there has to be a shift in frequencies. And that's the sense of the verb in the Greek. He chose to make himself visible to. But my sense is, it's not just that he chose to make himself visible to, but there had to be cooperation from the other side. Only those disciples who chose to make the frequency shift could be at the same level so they could actually see him. So not everybody is going to have this experience. So that's what appearance means in some sense. Now, one of the questions, for a few minutes, I'm going to get really facetious and I'm going to play around with stuff. And the reason I'm doing it is not out of disrespect. It's because I want to shake up the box and begin saying, guys, we can't look at the scriptures with a fundamentalist, literalist mindset. You've got to start, relating to them very, very differently. So why didn't they recognize him? How was it that Mary of Magdala, who knew him probably best as an adult, couldn't recognize him? She thought he was a gardener. Or that the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus didn't recognize him. I remember when I was still living in Kenya, at one stage I was giving a week-long retreat to a group of African sisters called the Asumbi Sisters. And at the end of the retreat, I had an open session of question-answer discussion. And I was really tired at this stage. I'd been 7 days away from my own mission, and I had like about a 7-hour drive back home when the retreat was finished. So we just finished a lecture on resurrection. And one of the sisters says to me, Padre, mbona wafuasi wake Yesu hawakumtambua baada ya kufufuka kwake? Why was it that the disciples of Jesus couldn't recognize him after he had risen from the dead? And being the Irish, punster and joker that I am, I thought I'd have a bit of fun and get a laugh. And I said, Sababu, wakati alikuwa kaburini, aling'oa ndevu yake. Because while he was still in the tomb, he shaved off his beard. And I'm thinking, I'm going to get this response. There's going to be a little giggle, or a guffaw. There was dead silence. And this says, Kumbe, Padre. Wow, Father. And I had this vision. I'm going to come back here someday, and there's going to be a brand new Christian sect called the Followers of the Clean-Shaven Jesus. So why didn't they recognize him? It wasn't because he shaved off his beard. So what was it about him? When you think about it, as these two guys are walking on the road to Emmaus, how many other people do you think are walking on that road with holes in their hands and holes in their feet? Now the guy's wearing sandals, and a tunic. If they had eyes in their head, they'd say, what happened to you? You're bleeding. My God, oh my God, look at your feet. Everything is bleeding. How could they not recognize him? If he was walking around with holes in his feet and holes in his hand, why wouldn't they recognize him? How many more people are walking around at that time with holes in their hands and feet? It should have been a dead giveaway, but it didn't. How come they didn't get his accent? He had a Galilean accent. They should have picked that up immediately. How come they didn't even recognize his voice? If he changed his physical appearance, how come they didn't even recognize his voice? And the other kind of facetious observation I thought this morning was, where did he get the clothes from? Now, if you lived in Kenya or in Ireland, when I was a kid growing up in Ireland, basically as a small kid, between ages 4 and ages 10, you had one outfit. And it was typically a short pants and a jersey that you got from a hand-me-down from an uncle. You started off and it was 5 sizes too big for you, and you finished up and it was 3 sizes too small for you. And that's all you had as a child. And then you got an outfit for your teenage years, and that's all you had through high school. I can tell you, there were 43 guys in my seminary class in 1964. I don't think any of us had more than 2 trousers and maybe 3 shirts. Max, that was it. We got through 8 years of seminary, and that's all you have. I got to Kenya, and basically it's the same situation. A child has one outfit from the time he's 3 until the time he's 12. Then he gets another outfit. And when he's an adult, he gets a third outfit, and he wears that outfit. That's his Sunday suit, his Monday suit, his Wednesday suit, his Friday suit. That's all he wears. Now, I'm presuming it was the same at the time of Jesus. Jesus probably had one outfit that was made by his mother once he became an adult. Now, we know that when he was crucified, that was given away. The soldiers cast dice for his tunic, and they gave away, they took his clothes. So when he's taken down from the cross, he's naked. He's wrapped up in a burial shroud, and he's put into the tomb. But we know that when they opened the tomb, the burial shroud is folded up very neatly, and the headpiece is there. So is he wandering? Is he wandering around starkers? When he met the 2 guys on the road to Emmaus and Mary of Magdala, did he have to kind of cover his nakedness? Excuse me, I had to leave home in a rush. What happened? Or did the angels, when they came down to open the tomb, did they kind of do a diversion and go through Nordstrom's and buy him kind of a cute Easter ensemble and say, here, I think this is your size, try it on? Or did he get up really, really early in the morning and sneak into the suburbs of Jerusalem and steal a tunic off a clothesline? Where, in God's name, did he get the clothes? And of course, the truth is, we're not talking about a physically resurrected Jesus. That's not the message here. So this is the ridiculousness we get when we just think with kind of literalist, fundamentalist thinking. So now we have to realize there's something very, very different happening. And that's my third point this morning. There is this extraordinary connection between Eucharist and resurrection. It's interesting to me that Jerry's reading for us this morning was from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 2 chapters before that, Paul devotes an entire chapter to Eucharist, and 2 chapters after that, in chapter 15 of the same letter, he devotes an entire chapter to resurrection. So you have chapter 11 is Eucharist, chapter 13 is love, and chapter 15 is resurrection. And that's done by purpose. Love is the connection between Eucharist and resurrection. You can't understand one without the other. So again, I'm going to break them asunder. I'm going to break down the typical misunderstanding and try to create a proper understanding. You think about Eucharist. There are about 1.2 billion Catholics on planet Earth right now. 1.2 billion Catholics. Every Sunday we come to Mass and we celebrate Eucharist. And at some stage, the priest is going to hold up one of these, a larger version of this, and he's going to say, if you were saying it in Latin, hoc est enim corpus meum. This is my body. And then this host becomes, according to Catholic theology, the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ. Now, if there are 1.2 billion Catholics on the planet, and they go to Mass, let's say 50 Sundays a month, that's 50 billion hosts. And if this has been happening for 2,000 years, you're talking about 100 trillion clones of Jesus. So 100 trillion times, Jesus had to clone himself, and take occupancy of a little piece of unleavened bread that looks like this. If you understand the scriptures literally. Of course, that is not what Eucharist is about whatsoever. Jesus is not confined to this. If I let this fall, Jesus wouldn't wake up in the morning with a headache, because this is a symbol. What does it represent? It represents the fact that his disciples had Eucharistic banquets with him. And after his resurrection, it was precisely in the breaking of the bread that they could shift their state of consciousness and meet real Jesus. Not a physiologically reassembled molecular matter Jesus, but a Jesus operating at a far, far higher level. This becomes part of the ritual, part of the protocol, part of the symbolism which allows you to shift your state of consciousness so that by going into a different state of consciousness, you're meeting Christ vibrating at a totally different frequency. That is what Eucharist, properly understood, is about. It's not about Jesus kind of being crunched up claustrophobically in a small little piece of unleavened bread. If we don't get that, Eucharist is merely the transfer of a piece of bread from a hand to a mouth. If something hasn't happened in your psyche, then all you're doing is you're having a piece of bread. If you really understand what it is, there's a real meeting with the historical Jesus happening. And the second piece is resurrection. How do you then understand resurrection? And again, I'm being facetious in order to establish a deeper meaning for resurrection. According to the gospel account, Jesus spent 40 days after his resurrection before he ascended back to heaven. Now, where did he spend those 40 days? Because when you look through the scriptures, he only made about 6 or 7 appearances to his disciples, each of them lasting less than 2 hours. So where was he for the rest of the time? Where was he for those 40 days? Did he kind of go back into the tomb, every evening and kind of hang out there for the day? Or did he go back into the desert and do another 40-day retreat and then come home? Or did he go back to his mother's house and say, Mama, shh, Mum's the word. Don't tell anybody I'm here. I'm trying to heal. I want to get rid of these wounds. I can't go back up there with holes in my hand. I want to heal. And that's great. I won't tell anybody. I've got a really good homeopath. We'll get a really good remedy for you. And before you know it, you'll be all healed up. And then you can go back up home. Is that what happened? So did he spend 40 days hiding out someplace else? Because the amount of time he was seeing is tiny. When you think the reason why the disciples went out fishing is because Jesus was gone. He died, he rose from the dead, he made 2 or 3 kind of cameo appearances, and they didn't see him anymore. So what happened to them? So there was no Jesus movement at this stage because Jesus wasn't there. They had no understanding what their job was. So what then is resurrection? What happened to him then at the end of those 40 days? We are told he went up onto a mountain with the disciples and he ascended into heaven. Now, do you imagine he had some kind of special sandals that were kind of anti-gravity devices that lifted him off the planet, like a Saturn rocket that he slowly ascended? Why did he need a physical body to do that? If he needed a physical body, it must mean that heaven is a physical location, a geographical location, where you need a physical human body in order to reach there. If so, he would have been in big trouble. You can't go more than 5 miles from the surface of the planet before you run out of oxygen. 26,000 feet is the limit that human beings can live in without needing some oxygen. So after 5 miles, he's a goner. So how did he keep going up? Was he kind of snatched up by a UFO that carried him further? Or had he volunteered for another mission on another Earth-like planet, someplace else in the galaxy where his human body would do just fine, and now he's off up there? So that's what he's doing. So even if he were traveling at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, even if he were traveling at the speed of light, he's only been traveling for he's only traveled a distance of 2,000 light years, which means he's still, in the cosmos. The cosmos has a diameter of 93 billion light years. In fact, if you just think our own Milky Way galaxy, it's like a disk, like a CD disk with a little bump in the middle. The diameter of the Milky Way galaxy is 400,000 light years. So if he's traveling along the plane of the ecliptic, he's still in the Milky Way galaxy. If he decided to fly orthogonally and go off at right angles to the plane of the ecliptic is only 1,000 light miles thick. So he's out of there now. He's in intergalactic space. And I hope he brought enough food for himself. So these are the kind of ridiculous notions you get into when you start interpreting resurrection, literally. It's not about that. It's about a total shift in perception and consciousness. the realization that resurrection did not involve Jesus just reassembling his molecular matter and walking around, and disguising his appearance somehow so as to fool people, is that only those people who could do the Woolworths window shift, who could change their focal length and focal point, who could access different states of consciousness, only those can make those real encounters with the resurrected Christ or with the Eucharist. And so this Easter morning, as we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, and as we come to receive Holy Communion this morning, what mindset are you bringing to that encounter? Because I can tell you that Eucharist is real presence of Jesus. And I can tell you that resurrection is right now.